Hello and welcome, lovers of true crime, who I affectionately call the Noir Nation. I'm back with another juicy episode for you. I also picked up a new microphone, so the sound should be much better this week. You know, I'm new to this podcast stuff and I'm learning it as I go, so bear with your sister, okay? Thank you, church. While my mic is better, Georgia pollen is killing me, so I'm a bit nasally sounding. My apologies, but we're going to push through. Now, I love true crime and all things black, and I've combined these two passions into a podcast, exploring some of the most intriguing and lesser known criminal masterminds with a melanated leading cast. Each week, I'm going to bring you the stories of some of the most prolific criminals you've never heard of. I'm your host, Renee Davis, and this is the Melanin Mayhem Podcast. Once upon a time, there was a dude named Richard and a chick named Dorothy Mae. They liked each other and they got married. They had a baby boy named Carl and a daughter named Sharon. Love fizzled as love sometimes does, and Richard bounced. Dorothy Mae had two kids and no dude, so she goes back to Michigan and starts life as a single mom of two. This is the story of how her son turned out to be a stone cold killer that they think killed more women than John Wayne Gacy, who killed 33 women, Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17, and Ted Bundy, who killed 35, all combined. This story is going to tell you how he became the first serial killer to almost be paroled after never having been tried for a murder. It's a crazy story, y'all. So buckle up for this week's melanated mayhem maker, Mr. Coral Watts. Coral learned at an early age how to play the system and beat them at their own game. He studied and he didn't make mistakes that would get him caught. He mastered the game of keep away and killed at will across multiple states and Canada. They think he killed around 50 to 100 people, and yet when he was convicted, he wasn't tried with murder or assault of any kind. It was only when he was about to walk out of prison a free man that the state of Michigan pulled a gotcha on him and convicted him on a Hail Mary case that he is said to have committed some 20 years prior. All told, this melanated baddie skated every time he was caught by police. Now, his government name is Carl, but his mama's people are from West Virginia, and when Carl would go visit them when he was young, they would say his name like country people tend to do, with that drawl, that made that one syllable name Carl sound like the two-syllable word coral. Carl! Hey, Carl! You know how we do. Anywho, they say Coral was a mama's boy, and when she remarried, her new husband came with a crew of his own, and then they popped out two more together, so Coral kind of got lost in the sauce. Add to that a bout with meningitis when he was around 8 years old that had him with a high fever for weeks at a time. After he got over it, it left him developmentally delayed and he started flunking at school. His sickness also left him having dreams of violence against women. He told the doctors treating him that he was tormented in his sleep by devil women, and all he does is hurt them and kill them and destroy them in his sleep. I can see the beginnings of some issues starting to brew, y'all. We got a mama's boy whose mama got a new man, and all the attention that used to belong only to him now must be shared with others. I think the resentment of women started right there, manifesting first in his unconscious state, but it wouldn't be long before it presented itself in a real fucking way in the real world. We're gonna start out when Coral was 15. He got a paper route, y'all. He's in high school doing normal high school shit, right? Well, one day while he was out delivering his papers, Coral knocked on one of his customers' door, and when she opened the door, he cold cocked that ass, proceeded to push her in the house and beat the shit out of her. Then he left and finished his paper route. Like, nigga, what? A couple days later, when the police showed up, 'cause the victim knew her attacker, It was the dang paper boy. When they asked him why he did it, this nigga say, quote, because I felt like it. Can you say red fucking flag? It's after this incident that Coral learns how to play the system by using mental defenses and going to the psych ward instead of the jailhouse. So after he mollywopped this woman, instead of sending him to jail, they sent him to this mental hospital in Detroit for a psych evaluation. The shrink did what psychiatrists do. They asked him all the questions and made all the observations to see what motivated Watts. Coral told them that he was about their life and he was ready to get out and let some of his violent dreams off in the world. The staff treating Coral knew that he was psychotic and barely controlling homicidal urges. But the doctors weren't the only ones asking questions, honey. Coral was also asking questions, and he was observing too. They asked him how he felt. He would answer and then find some kind of way to bring up his own pending court case into the conversation to kind of get some guidance on how or what to say when he was in front of that judge. He was devising his plan, man, for the courtroom. He was watching how insane people acted. The psych doc said in the end that Coral was struggling to hold it together and the homicidal urges were taking over. They said that he was a danger to society. So he's just barely hanging on, right? At any minute, this nigga could snap. That's what these doctors think, right? So surely they're going to talk to the courts and advise them of that, right? Well, maybe they did, but what happened? They released him from the psych center a year later on his 16th birthday, November 7th, 1969. And what did he do? He became a menace to society, just like they said he would. And even though they think he's gonna fuck somebody up at any moment, all they could do was recommend that he attend outpatient treatment. So he goes back home. His mom and his stepfather don't know what to do with him, and they can't understand why he is behaving the way he is. We didn't raise him like this. You know that old refrain. He does the outpatient thing for a little bit from 1969 to 1974. He went in for treatment like he was doing car maintenance. They said he went around 9 or 10 times. That works like 2 times a year. Hmm. And as he's trying to move forward, he is still doing the things that teenagers do. He's dabbling with drugs and hanging out with the fellas, and he turns his attention to sports to take some of that aggression out. And he's an athlete. He's excelling at football and at boxing. And he's got his mama helping him on the academic side because she was a teacher. And because of that, he was able to graduate from Northeastern High School in 1973 when he was 19 years old. Coral even finagled a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, but he blew out his knee a few months in, and there went his football aspirations. He went on to drop out of that school, but he moved back to Michigan and enrolled in Western Michigan University, or WMU, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Seems like everything is okay on the surface. Nobody has been on the receiving end of Watts's rage, and the last time he went to see the doctors over at the Lafayette Mental Clinic, he told them that everything was pretty much still the same as it was when he was a committed patient there. He still has these dreams that he likes. He's still kicking hoes' ass and taking names in his sleep, and it wouldn't be long before he beat up women in real life, too. In October of 1974, later on that year, he knocks on a student's door, Lenore Nizaki. When she answered her door, he says, "Is Charles home?" And Lenore says, "You have the wrong apartment," closes her door. A little while later, a knock at the door again. It's Watts asking for Charles. This time, instead of not answering her door or just telling him to get lost, Lenore asks Watts if he wants to leave a note for Charles. She unhooks the chain on the door and turns to get a pen and paper. Coral walks right on in and starts fucking her up. Choked that lady till she passed out. Then he left like he had just dropped off her Uber Eats. Over the course of the next week, students on campus are starting to report to security that there is a strange man that's knocking on their doors looking for somebody named Charles, and it's creeping them the fuck out. Then, police found the body of 19-year-old Gloria Steele in her apartment. She had been stabbed damn near 35 times. There were no witnesses to the actual crime, but neighbors told police that a strange man had been around lately, knocking on doors, asking for someone named Charles. So, how did Watts get away with this murder, you ask? When Gloria's family or her friends found her body, they cleaned up the house. Now, the tea is that Gloria's apartment, it had a lot of traffic in and out all times of day and night, if you know what I'm saying. So maybe it was less about them being neat freaks and more about them cleaning up the evidence of a trap house. I'm just saying. So, any evidence that might have been there to prove that Watts was the killer, like some fingerprints or some DNA, all that shit had been wiped away by the family. Now, on November 12th, 1974, Diane Williams is at her apartment chilling. A knock at the door reveals a man looking for Charles. Diane is also one of those nice people, and she goes to get this stranger a piece of paper to write a note for the person that doesn't live in her house. Watts muscles his way into her apartment and opens up a can of whoop ass on Diane, kind of like he did Lenore. The only thing that saved Diane was the phone started ringing. In some kind of way, she was able to knock that phone off the hook and start screaming her head off for help. She says Watts got up off her and calmly walked out her door. She saw him get into a tan Pontiac Grand Prix and drive off into the sunset. Diane called the police. The people on the phone called the police. And Diane was able to give them a description of her attacker and the vehicle that he was in, and she picked Coral out of a lineup. And a couple of days later, they arrested that ass and charged him with 2 counts of assault and battery, one for Diane and one for Lenore. And again, he was able to weasel out of these charges without much of a penalty. He told them that he was at the apartments a few days prior, but that he didn't have anything to do with no murder, none of that stuff, and he would be willing to take a polygraph if they wanted him to. Then he doubled down and was like, you know what? I'd like a lawyer. So they gave him the yellow pages and he let his fingers do the walking, and he found him a lawyer, and they let him go that same day. Now, what's crazy is that less than a month later, on December 6th, he was interviewed again in this case by an investigator named Ronald Freemeyer. And he told Freemeyer that he had assaulted at least 15 young white women. He tells this man that he was doing them like 2 a week. And he is just talking and talking and talking. Now, mind you, he's only 21 at the time, and he is running his mouth to the popo about all these assaults he supposedly have done. And after this bit of verbal diarrhea goes on for a little while, it finally dawns on him that it might be time to shut the fuck up. And he does so expeditiously and then asks them to get his lawyer down there. So his lawyer shows up, confers with his client for a little bit, and then his lawyer, guy named Roman, he says, you know what? I know my client has told y'all all kind of crimes that he is supposed to have committed, and as you can tell, this young man is deeply disturbed. We need to do something about this, and my client is willing to voluntarily commit himself to a mental hospital because he needs professional help. Like, nigga, what? And I guess the police felt the same way because they still tried to build a case against Coral. They searched his house, they searched his car, but they had nothing to tie him to the crimes. Damn it, man. So since they couldn't get him, they ended up getting him on a bullshit charge for theft of some wood from the university, right? And they told him you can either do 45 days in jail or you can go to the Kalamazoo Mental Hospital. Coral said, I'll take the mental hospital for 200, Alex. And while at the mental hospital, the doctors treating him said, quote, Watts is impulsive and unable to learn from previous experience. He blames others for his criminal acts. Shit, like I said, Coral knew how to play them doctors at that mental hospital because this nigga was indeed learning from his mistakes, and he would make few, if any, mistakes in his future criminalistic endeavors. He was up in the mental hospital still looking for legal advice. He was trying to figure out what he needed to say to get off on these assault and battery charges that he still had hanging over him. And Watts did his little time at the mental hospital, and then he skipped out on their ass again. And while Gloria Steele's murder remained unsolved, even though the officers on the investigation knew exactly who had killed her, they just couldn't prove it. Watts did go to trial for those assault charges for Diane and Lenore's attack. They gave him a year in the county, and he skated on their ass again, right? A year for really beating up 2 women. But he was also about to switch it up on their ass by not doing the whole knock knock thing on the door anymore. He's going to change up his MO and start hunting at night and doing a blitz attack. So when he got out the county jail, he went back to Inkster, Michigan and started doing regular dude shit like getting a girlfriend and making a baby. This is a high school sweetheart named Dolores Howard. She got into a little situationship with Coral. And once that baby came, she realized that Coral was a deadbeat and she put that ass out and on child support. And in 1979, he got married to a woman named Valeria. This marriage lasted all of 6 months before Valeria realized that her husband was a few sandwiches short of a picnic. She says she quickly realized that Coral was off because he started doing crazy shit around the house, like cutting up houseplants or randomly just melting wax on random pieces of furniture. More disturbing, she said that he would leave the house for hours after they had sex. Wonder what he was doing. But the straw that broke the camel's back for her was his night terrors. She said that he would be straight up fighting in his sleep, even rolling off the bed and still fighting on the floor, just wrestling. And she was scared to sleep in the same bed with him for fear of getting cold cocked by him during one of his nightly battles. Their divorce was final on May of 1980. Now you may be thinking, Renee, so far this doesn't seem prolific. He got a few bodies, yeah, but you can find that on a regular degular hood nigga on any day that ends in Y. And yes, as of now, the body count that we know of is one dead and three aggravated assaults. Well, buckle up because shit is about to get crazy. The state of Michigan was hit with a string of murders in 1980, and they nicknamed the killer the Sunday Slasher because the women started being unalived somewhere between late Saturday night into Sunday morning. So here is just a taste of the heinous Michigan murders verified by confession. But there are so many more unsolved cases that we believe Watts is good for. October 3rd, 1979, Peggy Pakmara is strangled to death in her neighbor's yard in Detroit. Then, on Halloween Day, a 44-year-old woman named Jean Klein was killed on her way home from a doctor's appointment in broad daylight, a few blocks from her house in an upscale suburban white neighborhood of Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. Watts stabbed her 11 times in her chest and left her on the street. What's crazy is that people were passing by her body and they thought that she was just a Halloween decoration. Then on December 1st, Helen Dutcher was stabbed a dozen times in her neck and back behind a dry cleaner in Ferndale, Michigan. She was not among the names of the women that he confessed to killing. An eyewitness to the murder was able to link Watts to her death. We'll come back to Helen's murder a bit later. In March of 1980, Hazel Conniff was found strapped to a fence in her boyfriend's yard with a belt around her neck. And Denise Dunmar, she was strangled to death in a parking lot. Both of those were in Detroit. April 20th, he killed 17-year-old Shirley Small in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He stuck her one time in her chest with a scalpel and hit that main vein, and he slashed her all over her face. She was a couple of doors down from her house, coming home from a party in the middle of the neighborhood where anybody could see. Then on May 31st, Linda Montiero, she was found strangled outside of her home in Detroit, just a few blocks from where they found Hazel's body. July 19th, Watts killed Glenda Richmond. She was a 26-year-old restaurant manager, and she too was killed right outside of her townhouse. They say he got her with a screwdriver, stabbed her 28 times. July 31st, Irene Condritz of Windsor, Ontario, was walking home at around 4 o'clock in the morning when a man grabbed her from behind and cut her throat. She didn't see him, but Watts's car crossed the border back from Windsor going into Detroit at 4:16 a.m. Rolling right along, September 14th, he killed a 30-year-old flight attendant named Rebecca Huff right in front of her apartment building. She too had been stabbed 54 times with a screwdriver. Now, do you see some prolificness? I'm not even halfway through my list. I'm going to give you a little bit of a break from this murder buffet for just a second because I know it's a lot. Like, these ones that I'm going to talk about next are assaults that did not end in death. In Windsor, Ontario, in October, he stabbed and savagely attacked a woman so badly that he left her with paralysis and knife wounds all over her face and neck. And then on November 1st, Mary Angus, also in Ontario, She was getting out of her car. It's about 1 in the morning, and she saw a man on the street. And he just gave her a bad vibe. And when she started walking, he started walking. So Mary didn't wait on nothing, honey. She listened to that little voice in her head telling her, "Danger, Mary, danger." And she just started screaming. The man took off. But they found out that Watts's car was clocked crossing the border back into Detroit about 10 minutes later. Now understand that the police suspect Watts on all of these crimes and then some. And I use the term police collectively because Watts had multiple law enforcement agencies on that ass. Ann Arbor, Detroit, Kalamazoo, the Canadian squads in Ontario. They all knew that he was the one, kind of like Michael Jackson said. And they tried to nail his ass, but they couldn't. And when I say they tried, one man, officer named Paul Bunton, who was with the Ann Arbor Police Department, he made convicting Watts his life's mission. I mean, he took this shit personally, kind of like Ice-T did with Nino Brown in New Jack City. I mean, everything they tried to do just did not work. They did things like creating a task force. They had round the clock surveillance on this man. They put a tracker on his car. They popped up on him randomly wherever he was. They were in his face. But this nigga was like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix on their ass. He was slippery. He was conniving. He planned this shit out, and everything that they could hit him with was circumstantial. Circumstantial, like when the women in Canada were attacked. The man that they described looked like Watts, and his car crossed the border back into the U.S. minutes after the attack, but it's still circumstantial. And what's really crazy is that while they were doing this 24/7 surveillance, they actually did catch him doing some fuck shit after he had killed Shirley. But before he killed Glenda, on November 15th, 1980, the police see this dude stalking a woman at an apartment complex. The woman realizes that he is on her, and she ends up shaking his ass some kind of way. They are observing Watts starting to lose his shit, like throwing a full on temper tantrum. And so they snatched him up. And when they searched his car, they found a book that belonged to Rebecca Huff. Remember, that's the woman he killed 2 months ago. But that evidence wasn't strong enough to be able to convict him. They didn't have anything like DNA or fingerprints or anything else that would just be substantial to hold and convict him on. And when you add to that Watts was street smart and mental hospital smart, they just couldn't trip him up. And they played this game all through 1980. They brought him in for questioning 3 damn times, and dude came in and played in their face 3 damn times. But seeing as how the block was hot, Coral decided that it was time to hit the road for some greener pastures. In March of 1981, despite his constant surveillance, he slipped out of town on their ass. But baby, Michigan was on some can't stop, won't stop kind of time. And they figured out that he ended up in Houston, Texas. So they hollered at them Texas boys and told them that they had a mess on their hands. They sent them a full workup on Watts. I'm talking booking photos, fingerprints, all of the crimes that he was suspected of doing in Michigan. I mean, they sent them everything. And they stress that this man is on the loose in your city streets and you need to put eyes on him before he kills again. The only problem was that in the early 1980s, Houston was like the murder capital of the U.S. They had lots of crime and not enough law enforcement to keep up, which was great for Watts and bullshit for the cops, especially because Watts didn't hunt in one specific area. He liked to roam, and distance was not a problem. How did he choose his victims, you might ask? He said he knew who to target because they had, quote, evil eyes. He also had a type. He liked them young, he liked them good looking, and he liked them white. Although he did throw in 2 black women and 1 Hispanic woman to add a little diversity to the mix, I guess. He would drive around for hours looking for and stalking his victims, sometimes while the police were watching him do it. His MO was to cut them, to stab them, to stick them, to drown them, to strangle them. He would use knives or any other type of pointy object that he could pierce the skin with. and he never had a permanent address. He was a tumbleweed, and wherever the wind blew, that's where he ended up. The police in Houston did take to heart what their Michigan counterparts were saying, but resources were so thin. They put eyes on Watts and they had him under surveillance for a little while, and they saw the same shit Michigan did. He worked as a mechanic. He would ride for hours and hours at a time, scoping, but they never caught him doing anything more than that. So eventually, they had to put those resources elsewhere. And when they did that, baby, Coral went to work. To say he ramped up would be an understatement. He killed multiple times monthly, weekly, and at the time of his capture, it was multiple times per day, attacking women. And the police were not warning the women. They were assuming that all of these random cases of women turning up dead were just that, random and unrelated, especially because they were in different jurisdictions. Coral's hunting ground stretched from Galveston, Texas to Austin, Texas, which is more than 200 miles or about 3.5 hours driving. That's a lot of ground to cover. And all these random overkill stabbing and slicing deaths of white women in the various cities and towns were not being connected. But one thing I can tell you, you can bet your ass, never in a million years did they even fathom that there was a black man out there killing all these women. Nor did they think that it was the work of one man. That was preposterous. It probably never even crossed their minds because, again, blacks are not supposed to be capable of this type of thing, even though the similarities in these deaths were off the charts. White women being unalived either by stabbing or strangulation, women being attacked and their throats slashed. This man was a monster, and he blended right in with the community. Kind of like Roberta Elder did when she was killing all those people in her house. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and check out episode 1. Coral was hiding in plain sight. He went to church every Sunday and even found him a good Christian woman named Sheila Williams that supported him and stood by her man when the shit went down. Sheila was a paralegal, and she arranged for Watts to be represented by a lawyer she knew when he was arrested. Here's just a little taste of his killer resume in Texas. Imagine going about your day, doing regular run of the mill tasks, and crossing paths with a monster, a drowning in a swimming pool. It could happen. And police thought that's what happened to Linda Tilley when they found her. They listed her death as accidental because, again, it could happen. But it turns out Watts had attacked her and they fell in the pool, and he held her underwater until he drowned. They say he was originally looking at another woman, but he lost sight of her and he went for Linda instead. He had followed this woman on the interstate for 160 miles. What about going out and taking the dog for a walk? Elizabeth Montgomery did that and got stabbed before she could make it back home. And wasting no time, Watts drove 2 miles and found Susan Wolfe coming home from the grocery store. He blitzed her in front of her apartment. And in January of '82, he killed 2 women. Phyllis Tam, she was out for a jog and got choked to death and hung from a tree. Originally, they ruled her death as a suicide because police said that there was no sign of a struggle. This dude is bold as hell because this is happening in the middle of neighborhoods, in front of these people's homes in many cases. Like, how long does it take for somebody to hang somebody from a tree and not get caught? Margaret Fossey was found in the trunk of her car with her throat slit. Now, 3 other women were luckier than her because they were attacked, but thankfully they lived to fight another day. Julia Sanchez had a flat tire on the side of the interstate, and while she was out there trying to change it, Watts rolled up on her and cut her from ear to ear. And then Alice Martell was stabbed 3 times with an ice pick. Patty Johnson, she got the Colombian necktie treatment too in Galveston, Texas. She also identified the wrong man as her attacker. A man named Howard Ware Mosley was convicted of her attempted murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison and had just started his sentence when Watts confessed to Patty's attack. He was granted a new trial and was able to get the charges against him dismissed, but damn, it makes you wonder how many men are in prison serving time for a crime that Coral Watts did. He only confessed to 1 murder in February of 1982. He said he killed Alina Samander by strangling her to death with her own shirt and then left her body in a dumpster. March was a three-peat of attacks. Emily LaCroix crossed paths with Watts and they found her body in a drainage ditch about 5 months later. She was only 14 years old. Then, on the 27th of March, he killed Edith Ledette, a med student and daughter of a judge. She was coming home from a graduation party when Watts stabbed her 6 times in front of an apartment complex. He walked around the corner and ran into Glenda Kirby and tried to unalive her too, but she was able to break free because his hands were slippery with the blood from the woman that he had just killed. Three seems to be his favorite number at this point because in April he killed 3 women. 21-year-old Yolanda Garcia, she caught that knife play in her front yard. Carrie Mae Jefferson, a black woman, got attacked as she was trying to open her front door, and it was a rare kill for him to select a black woman. And then lastly, Suzanne Searles was strangled and then drowned coming home from a party. Now, May 1982, his luck finally ran out. On May 23rd, he started his day out by killing 20-year-old Michelle Madej. And just like Yolanda, she was choked and then drowned. Then a little while later, he ran up on a woman named Lori Lister. She was headed into her apartment when she was overpowered by Watts. He made her tell him which apartment she lived in, and then he choked her out. When he opened her apartment door, he was surprised by Lori's roommate, a woman named Melinda Aguilar. He wasn't expecting nobody to be in that apartment, but he was up for the challenge. He dropped Lori's unconscious body on the floor and attacked Melinda. He choked her out. However, Melinda is able to keep her wits about her. She just pretends to pass out, and Watts carries her off into her room. He binds her hands with coat hangers and then he goes back to deal with Lori. Melinda says that she can hear him starting to run water in the bathtub. Looks like Coral was getting ready for another choke and drown session. And Melinda says he came back into her room to check on her, and she played like she was still out for the count. And she says that when he saw her, he started jumping up and down and celebrating like he had really done something. Now he goes out of her room one more time, and she knows it's now or never. She gets up and she locks the door to her room, and there's a sliding glass door that leads to a balcony. She still has her hands bound behind her, and she can't lift her leg up to go over the balcony. She does the only thing that she can. She goes head first over the balcony and thankfully doesn't kill herself from the 2-story fall. She hit that ground and popped right back up and started running to her neighbors who had already heard a commotion and called the police to report a disturbance. Meanwhile, back at their apartment, Watts at some point realizes that Melinda is gone and the jig is up. It's time for him to bounce. So he leaves Lori unconscious in the bathtub and runs out of the apartment right into the police. They got him, but they didn't know who they had. Now, when Coral gets to the police station, kind of like before, he gets a case of the verbal diarrhea. Like they asked this dude what his name was, and he started singing like the rent was due. He hit him up with this line, quote, "I want to get my life right. Let me help these people bury their dead." And then he told them, you know what? If you give me immunity, I will tell you who I've killed and where the bodies are. Houston agreed to that deal because they didn't have any evidence on him for anything other than that assault they just picked him up on. But the murders that they thought they did, they didn't have nothing. So they figured if we give him a deal, we'll get away with something, right? So what they offered him was a count of burglary with intent to commit murder with a sentence of 60 years. Since he was 28 at the time, that would put him at around 88 years old when he was getting out. And in their eyes, this is a win. He would be too old to get out and cause much mayhem, right? And on August 9th, 1982, he got his deal and he began to tell them the highlights of his murder resume during his time in Texas. Y'all, he had only been there a little more than a year. The police were looking at each other like, y'all hit his shit. Because never in the history of criminals getting caught have they sat down and started doing the cop's job for them. Them police was like, hold on, player, let me go get a pen and write this shit down. Hold on, somebody turn that damn tape recorder on because we got us a live one here. And he proceeded to talk and talk and talk and talk some more. confessing to murder after murder over the course of a few weeks. He had like a photographic memory, able to recite chapter and verse of his kills. And they would try to trip him up and change up some details, and he would catch them every time, like, no, 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 I didn't do that like that. That's not how that went down. And once they heard all these details that only the killer could have known, they were flabbergasted. Then they realized, hey man, he know where some bodies are that we don't know about yet, and he can take us to them. At one point, they said during questioning there were like 5 people in the room, and they asked Watts how many women had he killed, and he looked around the room and said that there was not enough fingers and toes in the room to count them all. That's 100 if you a bit slow on that mouth side. This dude said it was more than 100 and they had only scratched the surface. Then they asked him, well, why you don't just confess to every crime that you done committed and let's get this shit over with? You already caught. And this nigga say he don't want to go down in history as a mass murderer. It's too late for that, homie. When they took him to show them where the bodies were buried, this dude even had the nerve to ask them to stop and get him a burger and some fries. And if they didn't, he wasn't going to tell them nothing else. And so they did. While they were riding around on this deadly land trip, Watts told the detective, quote, if I ever get out, I'm going to do it again. Altogether, he confessed to 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 1 assault for good measure in Texas. He was on a roll like Cottonelle. Come on, Drake. And he told them that, you know what? Because I'm such a nice guy, I'll throw you 22 murders in Michigan if y'all can get Michigan to give me immunity too. Michigan gave him the finger. And the families of the victims in Texas, I guess, were okay with the deal. So Coral ends up with the deal of the century. On September 3rd, 1982, he stood in front of a judge and he got his sentence. And I guess they were starting to realize how much of a sweetheart deal that they had given him because they tried to do a little legal switcheroo on the charge at the end. So originally, the plea was that he would cop to burglary with intent to commit murder, which gives him 60 years max, right? But at the sentencing, they wanted to make sure that he would serve the maximum amount of time. So the judge on the case put a notation on the charge that the water in the bathtub was considered a deadly weapon. And because it was a deadly weapon, Watts would not qualify to get time off for good behavior because his crime now included a deadly weapon. And so off Watts goes to start his bid. After being convicted in Texas on the deal of the century in 1982 and skipping out on any murder charges and having to do a bid for burglary instead, you would think that this dude would just sit back and do his time. Not our boy Coral. This nigga instead decides that he is going to escape 5 months later. Now check this shit out. He in prison in Huntsville, Texas, waiting on his transfer. He leave his cell one night late. He got a pillowcase with food and gloves and a blanket and a jar of Jerry Curl activator. He some kind of way convinced some fellow inmates to stand around so that they kind of blocked a window, and he got behind them and started trying to kick the window out and proceeded to grease his body up with the Jerry Curl activator so he would be nice and greasy and could just slide through the window. Now that shit probably sounded like a good plan when he was thinking it up, but in reality, that was some of the stupidest shit he could have ever come up with. Like, dude, what the fuck? He got caught and then got sent to the hole for his little escape to nowhere. So escape is now off the table, right? So next up, Coral decides that he's going to start doing appeals on his case. And he tries a few attempts and they are denying him left and right. And then he hit pay dirt. Remember that little additional note that judge put on that charge about that deadly weapon bathtub water? That charge addition made him ineligible to get that good behavior time. And the courts found that to be unconstitutional. The courts ruled that inmates have a constitutional right to parole and good behavior time, and if those rights were being denied, the inmate had to be informed first before any plea deals were accepted. So since they didn't tell Watts his deal included that little blurb that would take away his good time, they now had to take it off the charge. And so now it's just a burglary charge. It's a non-violent felony. And the good behavior time would apply and would be retroactive. Time off to the tune of 3 days off for every one good day he served. Well, so begins the start of a major shit show. Because with this good behavior time calculated into the equation, Cora about to hit these streets again while he still got some pep in his step. Because this motherfucker got a release date of May 9th, 2006, which would put him at 56 years old with plenty more good killing years left in him. This dude had to have a patron saint because he was always able to slip through the cracks. His victims' families and the authorities, they tried everything that they could think of to keep him in jail or at least slow down the clock in some type of way. They tried to get the good behavior law changed. That didn't work. Coral's clock is still counting down. And Coral, all this while, he been laying real low. He ain't give no interviews the entire time that he was locked up because he wanted people to forget about him so he could just skate on out the door, sight unseen. And the people are losing their shit, y'all, because a serial killer, a black man serial killer that was never charged for murder, is about to get paroled, and it wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. Enter Michigan to the rescue. Remember when Houston was given immunity and Michigan was like, fuck you, pay me? And so began their mission to convict Coral Watts on any crime they could find in Michigan. They had a list of murders and assaults that they thought that he did, they just didn't have that evidence. So a task force was created. So their job was to find something in all these cold cases that they attributed to Watts and make a case that would stick. So they charged him with the death of Helen Dutcher from back in 1979. Remember, there's no statute of limitations on murder. What made this the better case out of all the suspected murders? Well, the day Helen was killed, there was an eyewitness. Now you might be like, wait a minute now. We talking about a murder that happened 25 years ago and you finna come up with the eyewitness 25 years later? Yes, indeed, that's exactly what we're gonna do. A man named Joseph Foy lived behind the dry cleaners where Dutcher was killed. And on the night of the murder, he was the one that called the police to report that a woman had been hurt and that he saw the man that did it. They brought him into the station that very same night, and he worked with a sketch artist and came up with a composite sketch of the murderer. All that they had at the time was the sketch, but there wasn't a lineup for whatever reason for Foy to look at. So it just dropped. Fast forward, when Watts was on trial in Houston, his face was on TV. And one day, Foy was flipping through channels and he saw him. He immediately called the police and was like, hey, that man that killed that lady back in '79 is on TV. It's the dude that killed all those women in Texas. Again, the cops were like, thank you, but Texas is handling that ass, so we don't need anything from you, but you have a good day. But now that Watts is about to get out, they got this man wrapped in bubble wrap to protect him at all costs because he is the key to their whole circumstantial case. His testimony is what they are pinning all their hopes and dreams for a conviction on. Michigan charges Watts with first-degree murder, which comes with an automatic life sentence on November 8th, 2004, and on November 17th, a little less than 2 years before he was scheduled to be released from prison in Texas, Watts was convicted of Helen Dutcher's murder, and he was given a life sentence for that crime on December 7th, 2004. Now, Michigan was on a roll, and they were determined that this nigga will never, ever see the light on the outside again, and they charged him with Gloria Steele's murder. Remember, she was the black girl at WMU that they cleaned the crime scene? And on July 25th, 2007, the trial began, and it was over the next day on July 26th, and the next day on July 27th, the jury came back with a guilty verdict for this 27-year-old murder. They gave him another life sentence without parole on September 13th, 2007. Well, old Coral's got 2 life sentences now. He'll be state property for the rest of his life, right? He sure will. It's just too bad that those life sentences expired 2 weeks later on September 21st, 2007, when Coral Watts died from prostate cancer. Coral Watts, he was smart. They said he had an IQ of 68, but that just goes to show you that you can't put all that stock in standardized testing. He was cunning. He played a cat and mouse game with police in multiple locations. He was careful. He was organized and he was quick with it, like in and out like a robbery. He didn't linger with his victims like some psychopaths do. He overpowered them and unalived them with a quickness and dipped on their ass. And since his kills didn't have a sexual component to them, there was no DNA for the cops. If that man had not gotten greedy on May 23rd, he wouldn't have gotten caught. This nigga could have still been out here killing today. And that, Noor Nation, is the story of Coral Eugene Watts, a melanated mastermind, a prolific serial killer that you've never heard of. I hope you found this episode interesting and informative. If you did, drop your girl a review and tell me all about it. And then I need you to go tell a friend and tell a friend to tell another friend and then your mama and them to join us at the Noor Nation. Melanin Mayhem would also love to hear from you. You can find us on all the socials, Facebook, Insta, and X at Melanin Mayhem Pod or Melanin Mayhem Podcast. And if you know of a melanated baddie that you'd like for us to do an episode on, you can reach us at melaninmayhempodcast@gmail.com. Until next week, stay safe, y'all, and stay vigilant. And remember, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. Noor Nation is one love, and we out, baby. Wow.